Hello, folks, and welcome back to the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus Show live. And we're glad to have you back here on April the 19th. Wednesday, Woke Wednesdays. You got to stay woke, folks. And we're glad to have you back here as we bring you a special guest today. And let me bring Bob down as we usually start with Bob. We're going to bring him down, and as I welcome you, we're coming in from a different location today, and we're happy to have you here at Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus Show live. We're going to talk about what we usually talk about. We're going to first ask you, are you doing okay? Is everybody fine? I know my lighting is a little off today, but you can see my face, so that's all that really counts. Hopefully you can hear my voice as well. But here at the VADSBC, Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus Show live, we're hoping that you folks are healthy out there and that your families are doing well and that you're still making sure that you're taking care of yourself. We know this COVID thing has slowed down a little bit, but in a lot of ways, we don't have to wear a mask as much. In places, people have had a couple of booster shots. And people are feeling good. I usually don't wear a mask. I'm feeling pretty good on the plane, too, when I travel. But when things get a little different, I think I will wear the mask. I intend on doing maybe some traveling out of the country or something. I think I might wear the mask in on those longer trips, but we'll see. But anyway, make sure you're doing what you can do to take care of yourself, to take care of your families. That's what's important, because we need you around, because, we're here for the long haul. We're here for the battle, the long haul battle, the long game, baby. We got to make this union a better place, a more perfect place. And we've got some challenges ahead of us just from what we need to do from a democratic perspective here in the country. So it's important that you're here so you can take care of what you need to do. You know what I'm always talking to you about, and I talk to you about that all the time. You don't have to guess at it, do you? You know exactly what I want to talk about. I'm going to talk to you about voting rights and the importance of voting rights, right? It's important because that is the foundation of all democracies, is voting. If you can't vote, then you can't put people in local, state, or federal office to represent the ideals that you have and that you want to have for your families, for your business, and for the country. So anything that impedes those rights for you to vote, anything that stops you from electing people you want to represent you in a democracy is a problem. And that's why we need to get that voting rights bill passed while we chew gum and walk, because we have to be very, very intentional and vigilant on multiple fronts. So we're going to have to chew gum, walk, skip, and maybe play the guitar. But whatever it is, we need to do all of them, and everybody has something that they can contribute. And we're hoping that that's what we're encouraging you to do on this podcast with the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus. We're encouraging business people. We're encouraging folks who are supporting small business folks to get out there, to run for office, to make sure that you're voting, to make sure that you're supporting the things that you believe in so that you can do better things for your family, so that you can grow your business, so that you can get your fair share of resources from your local, state, and federal government. And if you don't know how, we're here to show you how. We're here to talk about things like that. Among other things, we have lots of different folks who actually come on the show who cover a lot of different topics. But today we've got a very special guest. I'm going to hold off. I don't get into the whole guest thing until about 20 so minutes into this. First, you got to hear me whine on, right? I'm going to talk to you about voting rights, and the same thing I talk to you about every time, because repetition is a way that you remember things. And plus, everybody doesn't watch this show. They kind of catch it when they can. We're on Facebook. We are on LinkedIn. We're on Twitter. And we are on, did I leave a place out? Yeah, YouTube. Once those shows are out there, once we have this talk, they're out there for infinity, for as long as those companies are around. You can always look up VADSBC, which is Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus. You can do a quick search on that acronym. Will come up that way, or you can just write out all the words, and you'll be able to pull up the various different shows that we've had There's been reruns. We did a couple of reruns in the last couple of weeks. But we had some good folks on. Who do we have on? We had the mayor of Dumfries, Virginia was on talking about some interesting things that they're doing out there in Dumfries from a business perspective. We also had out some candidates and past chairs of the Mount Vernon Democratic Committee, and people who are also, as I understand it, are also running for the delegate in this particular area. And just a lot of folks. There's been over 90 shows. So we've been at this a long time. Well, a long time in the sense that if we're doing it on a weekly basis, it's been over a year. So we got to keep doing it until we actually get this accomplished. So let me jump right into my favorite subject. Going to talk about it, voting rights. That's right. We're going to talk about that. We're going to first give you what we call the Trinity or the trifecta, whatever you want to call it, of how this all got started and why voting rights are so important. But I'd like to give you a quick history on that. And that quick history is the Civil Rights Act that was passed in 1964. It prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It also had provisions in the act to forbid discrimination on the basis of sex as well as race in hiring and promoting and firing. A lot of people fought and protested to make sure that that happened, as you can see on the bottom, with people getting, police dogs attacking them. And then you have in the middle Lyndon Baines Johnson, or LBJ, in the 60s, signing that Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's Martin Luther King, some other politicians around him. And of course, you have some kids at the bottom on the bus, sort of just a representative of, both young and old getting together, starting down the road. And the reason why we need to do that, why do we need to have a Civil Rights Act? Well, we got a United States Constitution. The Constitution says everybody's got the same rights, supposedly, but then you got sort of that, maybe not exactly. And that maybe not exactly is a reason for the Civil Rights Act, is the reason why this country went to war in the 1860s and the mid-19th century, because of things like slavery and people not having all their civil rights and things of that nature. And that is the reason why by the time we got to 1964, it was clear with people of like minds that we need to make this clear. Here's specifically what every American is guaranteed in the Constitution. So what was next? The next thing that they passed, because civil rights wasn't enough just to tell people what their civil rights were, they had to actually talk about voting rights. And this is the reason why I'm talking about it. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the act was signed into law August 6, 1965, again by President Lyndon Baines Johnson. It outlawed the discriminatory practice in voting that was adopted in many southern states, and a lot of northern states as well were doing some things that were not right as well. After the Civil War, particularly with the southern states, but also it had things in it that were what we call as voter intimidation and what we call voter suppression nowadays, like literacy tests as a prerequisite to voting, and things that they're doing now that we have to do is there's all kind of sort of what we call Jim Crow 2.0. Instead of them trying to make you do things back then, like recite the Constitution by heart, or guess how many jelly beans are in a jar, or bubbles on a bar of soap, or just outright attacking people and burning their homes and stopping them from voting, or either making people pay to vote. It was all kind of crazy things that were going on. Anything that the Constitution didn't explicitly say you couldn't do, people did back then. And even things that the Constitution basically said, hey, every citizen has a right to vote, they didn't care anything about that, particularly not with African Americans, not with women, because even when the voting rights was, voting started in this country, remember, it was only white men who were able to vote who owned land. Nobody else could vote, not women, certainly not African Americans or anybody else. And it wasn't until after the Civil War that the right to vote was granted to African American men, not women. And it was even further through the suffragette movement that eventually women were allowed to vote. And then eventually everyone else who had been somewhat discriminated against, we passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965, where we said, let's make it clear. Here is what it's all about. So that got passed in 65. Now you're saying, okay, everybody's got civil rights. Here's what they can do civilly. But then they said, okay, well, what's going on now? Well, people need a place to live, and people are being discriminated and getting housing and homes or purchasing homes, whether they're renting them or purchasing them, or just generally, you have to have some place to live. So what happened to prevent that discrimination with housing? What was passed was the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And basically that act said, it expanded on previous acts. It prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, the rental, and the financing, getting a mortgage, based on race, religion, national origin, sex, and as later amended, handicap or family status. And that would be whether or not a person was, this is live TV, folks, you have to work with me here. Whether or not a person may be of a particular single or not single, or whether or not a particular person nowadays either LGBTQ or whatever the case may be, all those things had to be dealt with. And Title IX of the Act is also known as the Fair Housing Act. Title VIII. I'm sorry, not Title IX. But anyway, folks. So basically, what you had was a Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act that tried to give people a base so that everybody would be treated fairly. But this sort of thing continued to be an issue. And as it continued to be the issue, other civil rights came from that. And as you would know, there's been many other legislation that's been passed concerning people's civil rights and what they have a right to and what they don't have a right to. And people will talk about a number of different things, from the right for women to have privacy, and that recent freedom has been taken away. The right for people who are handicapped to have certain rights that are prescribed by law. Those things came afterwards, and now we're having to deal with this Voting Rights Act again because there were problems that happened. And let me tell you what they were. And I'm going to cover those real quick. Then we're going to talk a little bit about our guest. So what I'm first going to talk about is H.R. 4. And H.R. 4 is the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And what this act did, in 2013, the Supreme Court, in all of its wisdom, took out what was known as the heart of the Voting Rights Act, which was a pre-clearance requirement. If you could see those capital letters during that second sentence starting off, what that actually meant was before any changes could be made to any voting laws affecting voting for any Americans in all states, it had to go through a pre-clearance. And that pre-clearance was with the Department of Justice. And it had to happen 180 days before any elections. And basically what the new Voting Rights Act does, since the Supreme Court took it out in 2013, because in their wisdom, they said there's no more discrimination that's going on in the United States. There's no problem with voting. There's nothing here to deal with here. So we won't get rid of all the Voting Rights Act. Let's just take out that requirement that prevents states from making laws on their own concerning voting rights. And of course, as soon as that happened in 2013, that is when voter suppression started immediately back up in full throttle. And you're saying, well, what did they do? Okay, they started purging polls for people. And what this Voting Rights Act, the John Lewis Act addresses is those sort of things. Oh, excuse my technology here is going off on me. So I cannot have anything. This is what you get when you get technology going off on you here. I'm trying to cancel this. Stay with me here, folks. I'll get it canceled. But anyway, um, what the voting rights, the HR 4 actually did, and I'll start over again. I'm sorry about the interruption, is that it basically said that people could no longer do things of that nature. And they couldn't do things like purging the polls. They couldn't do things like if they purged the voting polls, meaning if you voted in one election in you showed up for the next election to vote, but let's just say you didn't. I'm sorry, let me start over again. I'm getting it mixed up. You voted in one election, but the following election, you chose not to vote for whatever reasons. And then the next election, or the third election, you decided to vote again, they purged your name off of the polls, so you wouldn't be able to vote. You're like, well, Jesus, I'm registered to vote. I always vote here. Just because I didn't vote in the last election doesn't mean that you should have taken my names off the polls. Or other voter suppression things that they would do is they would remove absentee voting, or what you call voting by mail. They would not allow voting by mail. So it made it harder for people who couldn't come into the polls directly to vote. In order to vote, they would do things like that. Or the other things that they would do is they would say, they'd move your polling place. So if your polling place was right in your neighborhood, now it's 10 miles away. So now you can't get to your polling place, right? Or if your polling place needed, 20 machines in there because there's lots of people who come to vote, they would cut down the number of machines. Instead of 20 machines in there, they would put 5 in there. You're like, well, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that, if they move the polls away, they reduce the number of machines, that just simply means that it makes for a really long line to vote. So people have to go to work. They can't just sit around and wait for hours and hours to vote. That's called voter suppression. These things are done not in all neighborhoods, in specific neighborhoods. These are the things that they would change. And you would try to say, oh, so that's what the voter suppression is exactly. And then they would make laws like, by the way, we know there are long lines. You can't bring people something to eat in line, or you can't bring them any water or anything to drink. We're making that illegal too, even though we moved the voting place, added less, took away machines, purposely made it longer for you to vote. So you take hours and people have to go to work. Everybody's not independently wealthy. And nobody could bring you anything to eat or drink. Or they'd get rid of something called souls to the polls, where voting places would be open on Sundays. So people would leave from church and get in their church bus, all go together and vote. These are all voter suppression techniques. More than 443 laws were passed in 43 states after 2013 that were voter suppression laws. And you're saying to yourself, well, I was able to vote. I don't see what all the problem is. Well, there's a lot of people who couldn't vote, but there's a lot of people, because of the work of Democrats and like-minded people who don't like this. We worked hard to get through all of those obstacles. But the other problems that we had to deal with in 2020 was, well, even once you make it through all those obstacles, they were going to not count your vote, where they were trying to make sure that, well, instead of once all the votes are in, we're basically going to make sure that if we don't like the outcome of the votes, we're going to say, we don't like that outcome. We're going to move it to a gerrymandered and Republican-controlled state legislator, and they would decide whether or not the election was fair or not, and whether or not they need to throw out votes or do other things, all kind of stuff like that. So basically, it's like, if we can't stop you from voting, even when the votes come in, then we're going to try and fix it. So you know what? That's what voting rights bills are all about. Stopping people from fixing the game after you voted, essentially stealing your votes, and also preventing people from making it difficult for you to vote. Now, here's the good news. If you live in Virginia, one of the best states you can vote in, one of the most progressive states, man. You got a long time to vote. You can vote by mail. You got places to drop off your places where you want to vote. And Virginia is so open that we actually lost all three of our statewide offices, but we didn't complain. Here's the way democracy works. Get your people out to vote. If for some reason the message that you're telling your folks is not good enough to persuade them to come out, or you can't do a good, what we call a GOTV, a get out the vote effort, you've got no one to blame but yourself. But what you don't do, and what we're telling you what you ain't going to do, is fix the game. And that's what they've been trying to do. They don't have a good message, our competition. So they're figuring, let's fix the game. Make it hard for people to vote. And even if they do vote, let's find a way where we can take those votes away. That's not American. That's not a Democratic thing. That's not a Republican thing. It's not an American thing. And guess what? I don't care where you sit on the fence, along the fence, on what side of it or on it. Voting is everyone's right as an American, and nobody has any right to prevent people from voting and from counting those votes, and let the best ideas and the best people who are out there simply win. That's the way it's supposed to go. So we're about 7:21 in, but I'm going to tell you something, folks. We're going to talk about one other thing here too. Now, there was another bill that was passed that was called H.R. 1, because the Democrats said, well, guess what? We want to pass this thing called For the People Act. And the For the People Act basically said, okay, we're going to even put more things out there that make it easy for people to vote. So what they did, they wanted to expand the access to voting by having automatic and same-day voter registration nationwide, 2 weeks of early voting so people can vote early before the election. They banned that whole purging of the voting poll rolls that I told you about. No more of that. Restore the full protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which was decimated by the Supreme Court in 2013 by putting the pre-clearance requirement back in there. So they're saying put it back in. And also finance reforms like banning foreign money loopholes, and also adding more resources for election security and independent commissions preventing gerrymandering. So that thing that we were talking about, people trying to steal the vote, the election after the vote, preventing that. Also grants to help states replace old voting machines, and additional processes for auditing and securing election results. Yep. We here in America, people would probably say, man, those Americans sure do a lot of talking. They don't always get things right, but they eventually, after they try all the bad stuff, they find out, okay, this is the right way to do it. So, folks, stay involved, stay woke, stay involved at a local level, at a state level, and at a federal level when it comes to securing your right to vote, because those rights to vote are important. Let me get my hair back out of the way here. I'm looking at myself on the screen saying, hey, man, why's my hair all over the place? But anyway, you have to stay involved because people are trying to take your rights away, whether it be women's privacy in healthcare, whether it be people being taught all of American history regarding what this country is, and the sort of things that we've been challenged with, just so we don't make the same stupid mistakes over again. So banning books, I mean, just all kind of crazy things. But guess what prevents all of that? The vote. Exactly. And why do you think they go through so much trouble to prevent your ability to vote? Because it's important. And they want to make sure you don't influence the outcome on how your government should work. So make sure you vote. Now, listen, here's your call to action. I'm going to skip the part of what the Senate does. The Senate put out a bill too. The first two bills, H.R. 1 and H.R. 4, came out of the House of Representatives on a federal level. But the Senate did its part too. But guess what? We have to stay vigilant. Even though we had all the votes and we had control of the Senate, the Voting Rights Act didn't pass. You needed 60 votes, or you needed a majority of votes, a simple majority, whatever it was. But guess what? I think it was 60. I think it was 60. But that's not the point. The point is, we had some folks who didn't vote for voting rights that were working with Democrats. And as a result, the voting rights bill did not pass. The John Lewis voting rights bill, H.R. 4, the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And of course, you all know John Lewis almost got killed getting that voting rights bill passed in the 60s, where he got beat to death almost on the Pettus Bridge. Yeah, I think it was Alabama. And so if you have people who are in your Congress who don't think it's a good idea for people to have voting rights, you want to make sure you elect enough people, either vote those people out or elect enough people so that if a couple of people decide they're not going to vote for the voting rights bill, it won't make a difference, because we'll have a majority that basically covers all that. Call to action real quick. On your iPhone and on your Google phone, you have an app that's called the five calls. And if you download that onto your phone, the 5 Call app, that basically has all of these issues right there on your phone. And that allows you basically to go to the issue, and it provides all your congressman's numbers, wherever you live at. You put in your address, you tell them where you are, all that information's there. It loads up the issue, and then basically it has the number there. All you got to do is push the button and call your congressman and say, hey, I know about the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, H.R. 4, and I know about the Freedom to Vote Act, H.R. 1 as well. I want to make sure you support that. If you're my congressperson, my senator, or even my representative, I want you to support that. And it gets to the president's desk, he signs it, and it becomes law, and this is behind us. That's one issue. We got other issues to deal with too, but that's why that's important. So there is a call to action, and that's what I'm asking you to do. But right now, folks, I'm about to introduce our guest. You've heard me talk a little bit, probably more than you want to hear me talk. I do this all the time. I never get tired of talking about it. But listen, let me introduce you to someone. I want you all to know about this gentleman. His name is Darold Hamlin. He's a founding partner of the Emerging Technology Consortium. They call it the ETC. It's a not-for-profit 501c4 organization, a group of companies and individuals that are dedicated to ensuring the benefits of technology, in this case, ownership and new economy jobs, reach all communities. Before starting the ETC, as chief operating officer he was the chief operating officer for Logistics Systems, Inc. Darold was also CIO, or Chief Information Officer, for the City of Philadelphia and the Metropolitan Area Rapid Transit Authority, also in Atlanta. And I might have messed up on my sentence there, but you understand it. Basically, he had 2 jobs where he was CIO, the City of Philadelphia, and also working for the Metro Area Rapid Transit Authority in Atlanta. He is also a veteran. He's a retired military officer. I mean, this guy's done a lot of things. In the United States Reserves, he's also a professor. He was a professor for the military science and departmental chair at Fordham University in New York City. Also, Mr. Hamlin is a Norfolk State University graduate. Yay, HBCUs. There you go, proud. And that's in, if you don't know where Norfolk State is, that's in Virginia. That's why we're cheering him on. This is the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus, right? And also, he is a graduate of the Embry, Riddle, Aeronautical University, and Fordham University. He is also a certified business official in the states of New Jersey, New York, and Connecticut. I didn't bowl Connecticut, no slight to Connecticut, but we're going to have to ask him what exactly is a certified school business official. He's going to tell us about that because he's going to tell us about himself. But let me tell you a little more about the Emerging Technology Consortium's accomplishments, what they've been able to do with Mr. Darold Hamlin at the helm. Publishing technology incubator study for the District of Columbia and their economic partnership. He's also been able to be sponsoring, they sponsored the Emerging Technology Opportunity Development Act for the District of Columbia. And that's interesting. I'm going to have to ask him about that too, exactly what that includes. Also, they created the HBCU plan for Toyota North America. And for you folks who are not familiar with HBCU acronym, that just means historically Black colleges and universities. He also was a first round awardee for the Minority Business Development Agency, the MBDA, for their broad agency announcement in entrepreneurship and innovation for the HBCU path to sustainability. Also, he partnered with the Thurgood Marshall College Fund to establish the HBCU, Historically Black College and Universities, NDAA Advisory Board. And I'm saying, what's the NDAA? I should have wrote that out. That's the National Defense Acquisition Act. I think I got it right. National Defense Acquisition Act, which is passed as a budget each year for the Department of Defense. And the NDAA last time had recently $864 billion was the budget for it. Also, he was also an advisor to the Congressional Black Caucus and Historically Black College and University Caucus for the defense issues for the NDAA, once again, the National Defense Acquisition Act that increased the Historically Black College and University and minority serving institutions appropriation. He was able to raise that from $20 million to $130 million, which is pretty incredible. And I think he still continue to work more along that area. So folks, without further ado, I want to bring on to the Virginia Democratic Small Business Caucus show live is Mr. Darold Hamlin. Adding you to the stream, Darold. How you doing, sir?
Hey, Mark. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Waxed on eloquently about the ability to vote, but I'm going to start and challenge you on a couple things.
All right.
So first of all,
bring it down. People love you here, Darold, but we're going to have to stop it. There you go, man.
First of all, we got to all focus. And we got to change the name of the Small Business Caucus.
Okay.
Because if you start small, then you're going to stay small.
There you go.
And so we have got to, but it's so pronounced in government. But obviously, we're doing a good job because minority businesses have stayed small. So we got to change that. We got to move that and change that name to Minority Business Council or something. But I hear too many, especially people inside of government, right, are proud that they work for the Small Business Administration or the small business. I'm like, and we are small. When you consider the Department of Defense spends $400 billion a year, and I did a little basic math. And it said that if we had a 3% goal, that'd be $12 billion. I don't see $12 billion running through America's minority businesses, because if we had $12 billion running through, there'd be a lot more Black millionaires running around, and there'd be a lot more Blacks and other folks with good paying jobs.
Yes, there would be. And I agree with you. I think that that piece needs to be an equitable piece. Wax on more about it. I want to hear more.
Well, I looked at this. I said, our conversation can be very brief, and we've had a lot of conversations.
Mm-hmm.
So I decided what I would do is take the opportunity and look at the presidents budget for fiscal year 2023.
Okay.
Because you know what? It's great that you have the vote, but then I ask the next best question: what are you voting for? So, if the federal budget was $2.46 trillion,
Dollars.
okay, and 772 went to non-defense spending, but 858 went to defense spending, the ETC is trying to send one simple message, and that is the Black community's got to get back to basics. And
Wait a
that
minute.
is
No. I think let me stop you for a minute.
okay.
Numbers sometimes just fly by people. What you just said about the entire budget for the United States and what gets spent on defense and non-defense. Could you repeat that again just so people get a real understanding of what those numbers are on an annual basis?
And it's annual, right?
It's annual.
Right. So our defense budget, simply put, is now exceeding non-defense spending and is rapidly moving towards $1 trillion a year. Somehow, and maybe my mind's just real small, but if we got 3% of $1 trillion, I think our minority businesses and minority employment and minority communities would be a lot better.
Language is important.
Yes.
Darold, okay? When you say minority, it's not specific enough. I assume when you say minority, you're simply talking about African American, Asian American, Latino business, veteran-owned business, or woman-owned business. They consider all of these. So it's very important that you speak specifically regarding who you're talking about is getting what from. And by the way, I tell people from their tax dollars. This is not like money you're asking them for. This is money you gave to the government, and that your business is either going to get some of that back in investments in your company, or someone else is going to get it. But
and you're right, Mark. Language is important. But you know what's really important is not what we say the categories are. It's what's in the law.
Exactly.
And so here's where the minority piece works against us.
And I'm going to interrupt again, just so people know. I'll stop. I'm lying. I'm not going to stop. What's in the law only happens if you have people in office who make those laws. Go ahead.
Well, no, but we did make these laws. But guess what? We didn't make them specific enough.
Okay.
And so, for example, we have passed this HBCU law, this is HBCU minority serving institutions, right? And so everyone wants to see what we've done for HBCUs. But when you go back and pull the procurements of how much money was won, out of 60 awards, only 16 went to HBCUs, 11 went to schools in the University of California system, right? 8 went to schools in the University of Texas system, right? And then 6 or 4 went to schools in the University of Florida system.
So, and just so people are following, HBCU means historically Black college / university.
Mm-hmm.
And an MSI or an MI or a minority serving institution, explain what that is to people and what that means as far as where the money goes to who, because people don't understand this, just like they think CRT is taught in first grade. It's not. Could you clarify this?
Sure. The Education Act of 1965 went and designated schools by the percentage of their enrollment or by the percentage of their enrollment.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are 2 categories that affect African Americans: historically Black colleges and universities and predominantly Black institutions. There are some of those around. The difference being a predominantly Black institution was formerly a majority school whose enrollment is now predominantly Black. Okay. Both of them get preference in this language.
Okay. So Black or either Latino.
No.
Or just African American.
No. There is a predominantly Black institution category under minority serving institutions. Two categories affect the African American community.
I did not know that.
So, for example, a school like Georgia State,
right,
is a predominantly Black institution. Here in Virginia, Old Dominion is fastly becoming a predominantly Black institution.
Oh, it's not an HBCU, but the enrollment of the people who are attending that institution are predominantly African Americans.
Exactly.
I did not know that, and I can guarantee you most people do not know that, but they don't understand that in the way that it affects the budget. And eventually we'll get to this, how this affects small business. But go ahead, sir.
And so then when it becomes the same thing for Hispanics, which is important, right?
Yes.
Because there are Hispanic institutions.
Yes, but they go ahead.
And there are Hispanic serving institutions. And so those schools, and for example, I was in San Antonio. The largest Hispanic serving medical school is the University of Texas at San Antonio. Has a predominant Hispanic enrollment. And so they qualify for certain federal funds. So in those states where they have a system, then those schools get the benefit of the system's resources when applying for and being designated for selective procurements. Now it gets real interesting because the one which is in the news and everything else are the Asian serving institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? Almost every Ivy League school is an Asian serving institution because you only have to have a 10% enrollment.
Okay.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? Those Ivy League schools come after the same money that the HBCUs. So language matters. So the one thing that we are doing is making sure that as we craft language going forward, and we're saying since the Department of Education has actually broken the categories down, we're going to break the money down so that there's an HBCU pot, there's a Hispanic pot, there's an Asian Pacific Islander pot, there's a tribal and Native American university pot. Because today, what a lot of the agencies do, right? They satisfy their HBCU goal under the minority serving institution goal and say, see what we did for HBCUs, until you pull the cover back.
And what do you find?
So, so there are things that we have to do as a community. So, because what I was going to say is, it is excellent that we're focusing on voting rights, but what the Black community needs is a legislative agenda to support what we vote for. And if we had a legislative agenda that supported what we voted for, then maybe we would make a much greater dent in the small amount of money that we're currently getting.
Well, tell me how that affects small businesses, African American business, Latino business, Asian American business. Start off talking about how that affects HBCUs, MSIs, these other institutions, because it's that formula that gets broken down when there's actually money that should be going to these institutions that small businesses in the various different constituencies I just named would benefit from for their businesses, for their communities. Can you explain that a little bit and make it easy for people to understand?
Yeah. So simply put, when we talk about income inequality, we have to understand the government's role in creating the companies that are now worth $1 trillion. And so why I say it goes back to defense, only the federal government can do research because they want to find out, can it actually achieve something? Private sector only does research when they think they can make a profit. So that when we're looking at new capabilities, it's the federal government, and more specifically, the Department of Defense, that says, hey, can we create, and I always give folks my best example. The Department of Defense says they need to manage fluids better, right? And they say they need something that's pliable, resistant to a lot of variations in temperatures, is lightweight, expandable, on and on and on and on.
Right.
So you and I today know that as a plastic bottle. Okay.
Right.
Remember, for years, and you guys nearly as number gray hairs as I do, used to, we only had what? Glass bottles, right?
Or metal cans.
Or metal cans, right?
Yeah.
And now today, almost everything is what?
Plastic.
Right? Which creates another problem, but again, it solved the problem of weight.
Right.
So I tell the story this way. So DOD says, we need this. And so they go out to one of their favorite research universities and say, we need to lighten the load for the soldier so they can carry more fluids, and we don't want the container to be that heavy. What do you think he can do? And so they say, oh, well, how much do you think that's going to cost? It's, let's start with $50 million to just kind of figure out if we can develop a prototype.
Right.
$50 million goes to, let's say, our favorite university at Stanford, right?
Right.
And they start working on this pliable, flexible, right, liquid container. And after 3 years, they come back and say, we really couldn't develop exactly what you want. So you know what the federal government says? We know that you guys, that the technology is in there, but just hold your notes and you let us know when you think you can complete it. So 2 years later, there's a breakthrough at the University of Chicago, right? In biomolecular. And so Stanford comes back and says, you know what? We think we can do it now. They said, well, how much do you think it's going to cost now? They said, $15 million, because we almost got it done.
Right.
$15 million goes out, right? And so a year later, they come back and say, look, here's a plastic bottle. It meets all your requirements from temperature. It expands, it contracts, right? It only weighs this much. Now, guess what your reward is because of the Bayh-Dole Act?
They get to keep the IP?
You own the intellectual property.
Okay.
All right. And then guess what? You've only got to make two decisions. Whether you're going to set up a company to make plastic bottles for the Department of Defense, or whether you're going to go into a licensing agreement with someone who already makes bottles. Now, guess what? You're a $1 billion company, and Uncle Sam has paid for everything along the way.
And there's a difference between that and the STTR and the organizations for that. Explain the difference between how that's different from STTR.
So simply put, SBIR and STTR are 3% of the budget of the agency. And then they select topics, which means that the basic research has already been done.
Can I stop you for a second?
Sure.
This is my fault. I shouldn't use acronyms that people don't know what they are.
Yes.
Small Business Innovative Research is SBIR, and STTR is something. It means
Small Business Technology Transfer.
There you go. All right, now go ahead. I'm sorry.
Right. But the key is, again, they're small.
Right.
3%. And I hear many of our fellow members of the community saying that's our program. So
I thought we didn't want to be small.
I'm just saying, and then go to Congress and say, we want more SBIR, we want more STTR, but it's only 3% of the research budget. But we's proud, and we want more of it.
We want more than 3%.
We want more than 3%. Okay? So, again, the reason that we're fighting for the HBCUs to get their research and development, and I'll give you the example, hypersonics, right?
Right.
Hypersonics research came out of the NDA 2020, where they said we need to start doing hypersonics research. So the Department of Defense was tasked in the congressional language,
right,
to identify those universities that are going to be in the hypersonics research consortium. But when you understand the science of hypersonics, right, it's a bunch of other small sciences that make up hypersonics, right?
Right.
You got to have the materials that can fly through space. You got to design the hypersonic vehicle. You got to have the fuel for the hypersonic vehicle, right? And you break it all the way down.
You know what that sounds like to me? It sounds like one of the largest contractors out there that constantly, like F-35s. Right. I mean, it takes a lot of different stuff to put an F-35 together across the country. And
so you're right, Mark. And so here's the one thing, since we're getting the vote,
right?
I'm gonna challenge your listeners to say this: if the Detroit automobile, if the automobile manufacturers have subcontractors on the automobiles that you drive,
right?
Name me a Black, African-American, or even minority subcontractor on the F-35.
I cannot.
F-22.
I cannot.
Okay.
And I worked for Lockheed Martin for 20 years.
Right. And you know what they'll tell you?
Yeah.
What would they tell you?
Go ahead.
We don't have anyone out there that's qualified.
Wow.
And then I go, but didn't they give you the money to set up the plant?
Right.
And do the research to create the F-35?
I would tell them the same thing that, what's the Atlanta mayor's name again that built the international airport there?
Oh, Maynard Jackson.
Okay, I know you knew who it was. Maynard Jackson. Someone told Maynard Jackson that when they had the idea to build that international airport 40 years ago, or how long ago it was, he said, well, we can't find any qualified African-American or other minority companies to do any of this work. He says, hold up, wait a minute, I'll get back to you. And he had to make the call on this as mayor of Atlanta. He comes back and said, doesn't airports have a lot of concrete laid and a lot of runways that are all over the place? He says, we got plenty of contractors that can do tarmac and do contractors that are minority and African-American firms. If not, they have folks that they can work with and get that technology transfer easy to do. This is what can be done in large contracts like that. There's huge contracts out there. Maybe you don't have a minority company or an African-American company that's the size of Lockheed Martin, but you do have significant companies who are out there where that technology transfer can happen, and they can fill some of that with, like you made the example with the automobile industry. You know, GM has Delco, for example. Go ahead.
I tell folks, this is our Tuskegee 2 moment for the Black community.
Well, wait a minute. We didn't, you're right. We didn't actually get anything for George Washington Carver came up with all those inventions. I don't think Tuskegee got credited for any of that stuff. But go ahead.
Well, no, the reason I was saying our Tuskegee 2 moment, right?
Right.
Here's the opportunity for the Black community. The Department of Defense says 80% of its workforce, both in and out of uniform, will need a STEM skill in the next 10 years. Okay. The Department of Defense always pays for what it needs. Just like I gave you the example of the F-22, right?
Right.
And so we need to be focused, our federal legislators, right, that before you sign on the next vote to allow immigrants to come in this country who have STEM skills, right? And oh, by the way, it's amazing in the Department of Defense today, to the best of my knowledge, they have a SMART scholarship, or their STEM scholarship program. You know how many STEM scholarships the Department of Defense has overall?
Go ahead and tell me what they are, Darold.
480 scholarships.
Are they actually filling 480 scholarships annually?
Right. But they just said 80% of the 6.7 million members that are going to go forward, which will be a smaller number, right?
Right.
Need STEM skills.
Right.
Don't you think we need to have some more SMART scholarships?
Don't we have a lot of HBCUs with amazing math and engineering programs and computer science programs that can create those graduates?
But guess who should be actually paying for to create those programs? The Department of Defense.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So we have a unique opportunity because right now we have 53 members in the House and Senate and the Vice President.
You're talking specifically, so people understand, you're referring to the Congressional Black Caucus,
right,
and the Vice President of the United States.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Anyone know what their legislative agenda is?
I know you're going to tell us.
Well, they do have two priorities: voting rights.
Mm-hmm.
And I say, well, voting rights are important.
You know, right? I know they're important. I support that.
But actually, we've been pretty successful. We got 53 folks in the Congress of the United States. Now our challenge is, okay, so now that you're there, what are you doing that's bringing back the community? If we're spending $858 billion on defense, shouldn't some of those jobs be in our communities where folks don't have a job? I always say,
yeah, I agree with you on that. And I know you're ready to say something else, but go ahead and finish it. And
I always give folks the example of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri.
Right.
Do you know what two defense contractors are in and around Ferguson, Missouri? The headquarters of Emerson Electric is in Ferguson, Missouri.
Right.
And there's another company called Express Scripts. Express Scripts has the singular contract from DOD to do mail order distribution of all pharmaceuticals for qualified members. Now, I said, you don't think we could just put a call center in Ferguson?
Mm-hmm.
The Ferguson hiring preference?
Yeah.
Right. This is not critical national security, national defense stuff, right? We just talking about folks that are picking up the phone. They're not handling any drugs, right? They're just placing the order to the person who's going to ship it. The drugs don't even come near them.
And once again, I tell people, this is your tax money. You're not coming there with your hat in your hand trying to ask for someone else's money. You're simply saying, we want equity with the taxes that we pay, local, state, and federal, to come back and invest in wealth generation and jobs in our community. And I don't just mean jobs, because we're going to hire people, but hiring small businesses to actually be the recipients of those resources and hiring other people in the community so that they're not just W-2s, but they're actually business owners and growing and scaling their capabilities so they can do other things. And I would only add one other thing to that, what Martin Luther King said. It's one thing to have the right to sit at the lunch counter, but it's another thing to be able to afford the price of the meal.
There you go.
We're coming to Washington to get our check.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
And so this is the opportunity. This is the moment, right? We have introduced the Colin L. Powell Minority Institute for Defense Research. And what it simply will do is have a place inside the Department of Defense that will identify all the STEM jobs that are there. And it will be comprehensive from a pipeline of students, because I think that's the biggest challenge in our community right now. We need to tell young men and women what to major in. And oh, by the way, we need to make sure that our community understands that DOD isn't just those folks who are in the uniformed services. By the way, just so folks understand the scale of the $858 billion that the defense budget is, the amount to pay the troops is $175 billion. So I don't know about you, but there's a big difference between 800 billion and 175 that's going to somebody.
Let's just round it off. There's 200 billion that's paying troops, and that's a big round off, I know.
Right.
But that means there is another $600 billion annually that is going to contractors. Is any of it going to our community and our businesses and small businesses?
And so
generally, and the answer to that question is no. You can't have large companies, and you can't. I always tell people, you can't hate the player. You can hate the game, right? Don't hate the player, hate the game, man. If you don't understand the game and you want to turn around and hate the player, you really have your focus in the wrong area. You need to.
We have such a unique opportunity, Mark. To play this game well.
Play the game well.
The HBCUs is, first of all, it is a bipartisan issue.
Right.
There are some of the most Southern senators that support HBCUs.
Okay.
Right?
Well,
let me finish.
I'll let you finish.
Because we never called them out, right?
Okay.
Because it happens on both parties.
Right.
Right. When Tim Scott brings together every year, Senator Tim Scott brings together. He just brought together
Small Business Caucus show, but you're gonna make a point here, so I want to listen to it.
Yeah. He brought together all these Republican senators to talk to HBCU presidents, right? And we have passed tons of authorization legislation for HBCUs. They should be part of the Defense Research Enterprise. They should be producing students with all these skills. But in neither party have they put the appropriation, because I'm going to close on, this is the word of the day, appropriation.
I was going to ask you about that next. Go ahead.
Because appropriation means that the federal government Congress has authorized a department or agency to spend money in this particular area.
Let me add some clarity to that for our listeners. First of all, getting back to the senator that you just spoke of from South Carolina, there's a difference between politics and policy. Now, people may be doing things to make it look good for them on a political standpoint, but the actual policies that they may pass or willing to pass or vote for as politicians are different. In this case, when we talk about, so I covered that piece, but when we talk about appropriations, what that really means is, and I want to make sure our listeners understand it and tell me if I've got it wrong, is when there's an appropriation, the policy or the law's been passed, whether the agency actually programs that money and spends it is a whole nother question. Is
So
that what you're
let me add a bit of clarity.
Well, do they spend the money in the right area? They may have a policy that says you can spend X amount of dollars on this, but that X amount of dollars gets, rather than being spent on this, it gets spent on that or not spent at all. Is that what you're saying?
No. So so you get authorizing language,
Right.
that says do this,
Right.
but if you don't get an appropriation, right, then you don't have any money to do what was authorized. So the appropriation is actually the dollars coming from the Congress to the agency to do what you want to do. And so what's happened on this is both parties,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I can talk about our senators here in Virginia who have hugged me and told me I'm doing a wonderful thing.
Let me say this to you, but let's keep this on the topic of making people understand the process, right?
Okay.
In the process, when we talk about appropriation, right, is
Right.
first, so when you talk about policy, that's a law that's been passed, right?
No. So the law is the law.
The law is the law, but I'm saying the law is policy. When people use the word policy,
You're not
I'm
interchanging.
trying to make sure our language is consistent so people
Right.
understand. That's what I'm
Well,
trying
I'm
to
saying
do.
the law is the guidance to the agency.
Right.
The agency then turns it into policy, which are
Right.
the executing instructions
Right.
for what has to be done.
Okay. The law gets operationalized by the agency
Through policy.
through policy, right?
Right.
Now, we still haven't talked about the money, right?
Right.
Now, explain the last part with the money so people understand the process.
So now you got authorizing language. There's a separate whole, in fact, all the money is controlled by the Appropriations Committee, both in the House and the Senate.
Right.
And so what I would tell you listeners is no longer get enamored with how big the number is.
Mm-hmm.
You want to know how much money is in your appropriations line. And the reason that lobbyists make their money is that they're protecting your appropriation line. So if you want $500 million or something, the lobbyist's job is to make sure that from the time you said you wanted $500 million, that it gets out of the subcommittee onto the floor in both the House and the Senate. And the final cut is, will it be cut in conference when they sit down before it goes to the president?
Well, and to make sure that people understand the process, you could have people who sit on the Armed Forces Committee that have input into what they think the budget ought to be for the DOD, right?
Right.
But the folks who sit on the Appropriations Committee determine what dollars are going to go where out of that big budget.
That's correct.
And lobbyists, which are in our Constitution. So people say, I hate lobbyists. Well, if you want to get rid of lobbyists, you have to change the Constitution of the United States. They're legal. So don't hate the player, hate the game. So understand the game. And the game is, if there's an appropriation line, in this case, for something that you want to make sure is delivered to your
constituency,
then you need to make sure that your congressperson knows about it. It is getting it to that appropriation committee, and that you have somebody outside of that has eyes on, and you ought to be that as the constituent, making sure that I'm watching this and I'm going to look and I'm going to go online and see, well, did they actually fund these HBCUs in the appropriation committee, that money's there? And then once you know that money has been programmed there and you don't see it happening in reality, that's when you need to pick up the phone and call your congressman.
And here's the last part.
Where's the money that's supposed to be paying for these F-35s?
Right. And they got their own line. The F-35s actually have their own line. But here's the last piece of the, since we're doing the lesson, right?
Okay, go ahead.
And that's why you've always heard the presidents talking about they want to have a line item veto.
Right.
Because the only control Congress has over the administration, who, by the way,
right,
gets to execute all the money that's passed.
It's their job to execute and operationalize all that. As I tell people all the time, your government has separated powers between the executive, which is the president, who carries out the laws and operationalizes them. It's the judiciary, which is the one that makes sure the laws are constitutional, and it's your Supreme Court and court system, and your legislators, which is the House and the Senate, that actually make the laws and have control of the purse.
That's correct.
Money.
That's right.
Go ahead, sir.
And so for our community, what we really need is a legislative strategy that should be reported back to us on every year. Now, the CBC actually puts out their budget, which doesn't look anything like what we've talked about.
Not at all.
But we should be providing input into that budget, right? And the last piece, that you have to have oversight, because them agencies don't follow the law. Sometimes they kind of interpret it the way they want to do it, exactly. Right? But that's okay, because you got that oversight,
right?
But what I've learned is I've worked this process for 4 years. I actually had to learn the whole legislative appropriations process in the last 4 years, trying to get this Colin Powell Act through. Is that it's a great system, right? But it is a full-time job, but it is a wonderful thing when you get the appropriation for what you want. And we can do a lot of things to move the Black community forward by not focusing on the big number, right? But we as a Black community should say, and what we're trying to get the CBC to recognize now, because a lot of folks are anti-war, anti-this, and anti that.
Right.
And we're saying that's fine.
Yeah.
Just make sure the HBCU line gets funded. Right.
Well, and here's the other thing. We're talking in particular and using examples with the African American community and how we're following how you would follow the HBCU appropriation line. It's fine. But what I want people to understand is the process. And we're talking specifically about the African American constituency, right?
Right.
But the process for, let's say, the constituency is just say small business.
Right.
Right? The process is the same, folks. You have to explain what it is that's in the policy that is going to benefit small businesses, that gets written up into some sort of law that eventually goes through the same process we just spent 20 minutes talking about. And if you want to impact small businesses, let's just say, for instance, small businesses only getting 15% of the budget. Let's say small business wants to be able to get 30% of the budget. Then you make that a requirement in the policy and the legislation, and it gets programmed through the Armed Forces Committee, and it gets broken out in the appropriation committees. This 15%, or it's now 30% to all these different agents, these different groups. And then you make sure they do it. That small business is getting a bigger piece. It's the same for everybody. You just got to know how to play the game.
Right. But you know what I would say to everyone, Mark? The way ahead for us is subcontracting.
Right.
And the reason, why subcontracting doesn't work? 2 reasons. One is that the federal government doesn't put enough resources into the administration of contracts.
There's somebody lobbying against that, by the way, but go ahead.
Okay.
I'm joking, but probably there is.
Right. Right. But they work at it and we don't.
Right. They're working it.
Right. And second of all, this is where our politicians can talk to the corporations and ask them, what are you doing for diversity and inclusion because you're in my district.
What are you
Right.
doing for diversity, equity, and inclusion in my district?
Right. Are you? You have a defense plan in my district? Do you have any black subcontractors? Can you create a program?
Or
Because here's the beautiful thing.
Or do you have any small businesses that are participating in this contract? I mean that's what I'm keep throwing both of them in there because I want people to understand it's the process you got to fix. You gotta stay engaged on the various different levels so people just don't think, well, he's just talking about what you can do for African American or black businesses. What about us? Well, it's the same for you. It's the same for everybody.
It's the same for everybody. And we've got to use the power that we have both in the executive branch,
right,
and the legislative branch. But our legislators and this letter was published, so I had Anthony Brown when he was a congressman write a letter to President Johns Hopkins and say, are you going to be subcontracting to the HBCUs in Maryland? Right? Imagine if every member went to the university and said, are you doing that? Right?
Right.
Because they're going to come to you for something. Right? But what we don't have for many of our members is, here's my ask.
Now, here's the last thing I want you to explain. We're well after 8:16, but that's okay. A lot of people talk about the FDRCs and the UARCs and how that works with not only African-American small business, but small businesses, and how some of the things that we're talking about in these areas and what these institutions get. Explain what they are quickly and explain how small business can benefit from their equitable participation in UARC and FDRCs.
Yeah. So first of all, the acronyms. FFRDC stands for Federally Funded Research and Development Center. UARC stands for University Affiliated Research Center. Both of them are the same thing. One's run by a university, one's run by a corporation or other entity. What they are sole source research contracts sponsored by the agencies in the federal government. When a determination is made, and the last FFRDC was approved for NIST in cybersecurity.
Well, and I want you to go back and tell people sole source.
Right.
The money is sole source. Tell them what sole source means.
So sole source means that entity was determined as the only provider of that service to the federal government.
And they don't have to compete for that money.
They just have to put out there's a sole source justification that is done as part of the process. For an FFRDC, it actually goes up to the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So it has to be signed off at a pretty high level. But when you get it signed off, that now the entity is eligible for a sole source contract. The normal minimum contract length is 5 years. And here's the one that will get you. Certain of them are 20-year contracts.
20 years, but I thought the administrations only go from, there's a new president elected every 4 years. So basically, you could have 4 times 5 administrations, or at least 2.
I tell folks that if you are the business development coordinator for an FFRDC, and most of them are in the Department of Energy, by the way, right? Then when you have your child, you can start raising them so they can compete for the follow-on contract. But you get money for 20 years, okay?
Exactly. So explain who some of these institutions are so people know who they are. Like, I know, give me an example of an FDRC.
So an FFRDC, for example, I was thinking Oak Ridge in Tennessee. Oak Ridge National Research Laboratory.
What about MITRE Corporation in this area?
So MITRE actually, and here's interesting. MITRE runs about 40% of all the FFRDCs in the entire federal government. Okay,
40% of all of them.
The entire federal government run by one company.
are there any African American or any minority FRD? Give me say it again. I always get that.
See, Mark, you know why they won't give us one? Because you can't pronounce the acronym. I said, well, of course you can't get one. You
can't get one because you can't remember the acronym.
You can't
bonus impression. So
you don't qualify.
Are there any minority or any African American institutions of this type?
No.
None.
And
African Americans represent about how many? Just take us, for example. We won't talk about Latinos and Asians later. What about 15% of the population in this country?
12 to 15%.
So, and there's about $2 trillion that's spent every year in the budget.
The total UARC and FFRDC,
the whole U.S. budget for the entire government isn't about $2 trillion.
2.4 trillion.
So if you just want to take large numbers and say, hey, let's just do 10%, I wasn't that good in math, but I managed to get through college, and you took 10% of 2 trillion. I mean, even you could do that, right? How much money is that? Just 10% of 2 trillion.
Yeah, that's $200 billion.
$200 billion. Does $200 billion come to the African American community in federal contracts, to your knowledge?
Well, no.
I didn't think so. But I'm just trying to make an example to people to let them know that when you talk about these things, and you're looking to get legislation passed and other different things and go through the process, you got to know your numbers. Because if you don't know your numbers, you don't really know what you're asking for and what the government, your government and your tax dollars have the ability to do.
That's correct.
Anyway, go ahead, sir. I'm going to make your last statement that you want to give to us, and then I'm going to ask you a closing question.
No, like I said before, this is our Tuskegee moment.
Okay.
The Black community has an opportunity. If we want an empowerment plan, it should be focused on two things. One, making sure that we fill a great percentage of these federal STEM jobs, not only in the Department of Defense, but across the entire federal government.
Okay.
Second of all, that we build our businesses, and this is how the UARCs and FFRDCs come in, is that we want to put our businesses on the boards of these federal research labs at the HBCUs, because when they get their research assignments, then we have the opportunity to bring new technology to market. Because I keep getting very upset when folks say the only thing that Black businesses need is capital, right? Because capital is green when you have something to bring to market that's unique. And what intellectual property brings is bringing that next new thing to market that we own. And so there is a route to economic inclusion, and it is based on understanding the federal government's role in wealth creation, which neither party talks about. And that if we embrace this strategy of making sure that we got our people through school using this ROTC model, where you would actually recruit the students, pay for them, and then actually put them in a job with no debt, what a difference that would make to the African American community. Then if we set up these centers of excellence and started owning intellectual property and started making product for the federal government first, because they pay, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I always tell the story, Lockheed Martin sold their IT business and bought Sikorsky because the rate of profitability on making something for the government was twice that of services.
Well,
remember,
as a and I'll add something else to that. As a 20-year employee of Lockheed Martin, I worked as a systems integrator at Lockheed Martin, created that business almost 50 years ago. A lot of other people got to. Basically, it's program management. The government's brains, you run their programs for acquisition. Okay, that's what Lockheed did. And people would think of them as quasi-government type people because they literally executed on behalf of the government, ran these programs,
right,
and helped their customers who were the government. But the thing about it is, in 2013, that business was the government decided, well, you got to either be in the acquisition side of the business or a developer side. You can't be in both. And at that time, Lockheed Martin got rid of all of their systems integrators that did what I just explained, because there was so much more profit in building F-35s,
right,
and building helicopters and other, not just fighter aircraft, all kind of aircraft and other different weaponry.
As a good Lockheed Martin stockholder that I am,
yes.
So it's amazing that last year they did $66 billion of business, right, and made $6.7 billion in profit. And
guess what? And that's your tax money.
And that's our tax money, right? And so certainly we have an opportunity to say diversity and inclusion should be more than just having a few good jobs at Lockheed Martin. You
should be one of those subcontractors that are building some of those satellite systems, the weapon systems, a number of different things that they do and build on behalf of the government. So all I'm trying to tell you is this is where we ought to be, and then the policies have to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and ask you one question I ask all people before that come on the show, and I'm going to ask you the question now, Darold. If you were king for a day and you had that scepter and you could wave your wand and you could have anything you want done by simply taking that magic scepter and speaking the words, and it would be done, what would be the first thing?
Oh, no doubt. I'm putting in a subcontracting program of 10% of every major defense in item and building companies around it.
How did I know you were going to say that? Well, you know, one thing, it's time for us to get ready to get out of here. And I certainly appreciate you coming on, man. Just want to give you the love,
my pleasure, brother.
You. I'm going to tell you, a lot of people learned a lot of different things today. If they come back and listen to this, you put on a clinic. And that's why I went almost a half an hour overtime. So, but right now it's time for us to go. We'd love to have you on again, Mr. Hamlin, from the Emerging Technologies Consortium, the ETC. Thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure.
It's time for us to go. We're bringing Bob in.
Hey, my pleasure. Look forward to doing it again.
Look forward to having you back, sir.
Thank you.
Take care.
You too now.
See you now.